Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are tuning in. This is day 2 of our Summer of Code 2018, where we look at the foundational elements, the foundational languages that surround WordPress development. Today we are going to be focusing in on CSS. If you're just joining us, don't forget the chat room is at WPStudio.com/chat. And there's a handout there. We're going to be doing something a little special in today's session that we haven't done in other core CSS classes. We will be spending some time looking at how to use or utilize many of these advanced relationships and pseudo classes within the browser inspector so that we can do live testing of advanced relationships. And we'll explain in just a moment why that is an important thing. So before we even get started, yes, yesterday we talked about HTML, and that was the structure, setting up the layout structure of a web page that a browser renders. Anytime we want to style that or present the layout in a specific way, that is where CSS comes in. And CSS is a cascading style sheet. So it's important that we understand what the cascading is. Now, we are right now. I'm just talking. You're just looking at the WPStudio background logo. If you're looking at the handout, I'm right there at the top on the first page. There's several core elements that we need to understand. All browsers, unless they are purposely set to never cache anything, and you would actually have to manually go in and change your settings of a browser, whether you're talking about Edge, Safari, Opera, Chrome, Firefox, whatever browser you're using. All browsers by default will cache a style sheet. Caching meaning that it will only have to load that style sheet, that set of rules, once. So that as we continue to use, like let's say you go to CNN. You visit the CNN web page and you're going to load all the style sheets once. And then if you start visiting other pages inside CNN, it doesn't have to load anything again. It's already in your browser. Your browser knows how to interpret the presentation layer for the CNN website. Unless there are changes or version numbers change for a style sheet. And then it will throw out the old and load the new. Now, that's a great thing about a style sheet. Well, the idea behind a cascading style sheet is we can load multiple style sheets. We can have a main style sheet, a custom style sheet, a secondary style sheet. In many times for WordPress, you may have a parent style sheet. You may have a child style sheet, child theme style sheet. Maybe then some of your plugins have style sheets. Maybe you've written your own custom style that you've added to a custom style sheet. That's perfectly fine. It's cascading. So even if the same style is applied to, let's just say, all paragraph tags. In each one of those, the parent, the child, the plugin, your custom stuff, even if every single one of those has a different styling for the paragraph tag, only the last will be used. That's the cascading concept. The idea that we can put a whole bunch of style sheets together, which are great for managing and making things modular, keeping things in their specific areas, but only the last, quote, declaration or explanation of how they want the presentation to appear for a paragraph tag is going to be used. So the load order of a style sheet is important. Now, before we get into any of that, we're going to start talking about the basics of a style sheet. Now, can everybody see this, the size here? Basically, I just have an example style.css file, and it has 2 types of statements. This is just comments. We're perfectly fine. I just put this up here so you know we were in a style sheet. So this is where we're going to talk about some terminology here for the next 5 or 6 minutes. Because as you grow in your development of refining your skills or improving your skills, there's going to be other instructors, other blog posts you read, other ways of soaking up knowledge, and people are going to refer to specific elements of a style sheet. And so we need to know what that is. So a style sheet, wherever it's being placed, whether it's a standalone file or inside like an HTML document, you might see a style tag that opens and closes, and then you might see some, content in here, font size 26 pixels. You might see something like this where styles are being put into the head section of an HTML document. So whether it's inside a style or inside its own style sheet or inline, which would be inside the document, and we'll take a look at that in just a bit. CSS is simply a list of, the first word to remember, statements. A statement is only 2 things. It can only be 2 things. It could be an at rule. That's what this is. It's an at rule. So this would be anytime you see the at sign, the at rule goes through and says, are we importing something? It's an instruction. Are we setting the character set of the style sheet? Are we assigning instructions or other statements to specific media types like Braille or handheld or print style sheets, or if it was on a TV? Or we'd have like a page, and in the page, this is where we would set, margins or for printing concepts. We'll talk a little bit more about the paging in just a bit. And then the other one that you may see, which is an at instruction, is the font face. Now, there's several different ways we do this, but these are types of at rules. These are instructions that are specific to what a browser who is taking the presentation layer of a style sheet, what they're going to do. So these are, let's just use the concept, these are CSS command lines. This is where we are making a statement that the browser needs to do something in order to process things that are inside the braces of an at statement. We're going to talk a bit more about the page and the media in just a bit, but wanted to point out. So one type of statement is the at rule. It's very easy to remember because it has this at sign before it. The second type of statement is a rule set. A rule set contains 2 parts. So an at rule only is an instruction. It only has one part that you have to know. Each of these at rules will have different systems that it uses. Whether we're defining the type of media it's using, defining what's happening on left page, right page. Those are all different things that we would deal with. But the rule set is a combination of the selector and the declaration block. So there's an easy way to remember these where these live. The selector is everything before the braces begin. These opening and closing braces. Everything inside the braces, the curly braces, are the declaration block. Now, I'm just adding 2 so it can be, you can actually see that this is a block of declarations. So we have a selector, a declaration block. Even if there's only one in there, it's still a declaration block. Now, a declaration block is made up of, you guessed it, declarations. And a declaration has 2 things. So the same way a rule set has 2 things, the selector and the declaration block, every declaration has a property name and a property value. Also, a declaration can only occur inside a declaration block. You can't put like fonts, you can't simply say, well, I'm going to set a font size of 26 pixels and it will be the default font size for everything. No, declarations must exist within a declaration block, which means it needs to be part of a rule set. Any questions about the CSS terminology? Because that's all you have to know. There's 1 or 2 others. We'll talk about it, pseudos, in just a moment. But we have selectors and we have declarations. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about selectors here this morning. So, and if you're looking at the handout, you're probably going to want to jump to the bottom of page 4 for this next section, this next part. Okay, so when we have a rule set here, basically we are saying our declaration block contains all the presentation instructions for this selector. Now, if we were to jump over to just our basic style sheet that we were, or basic HTML document that we were playing around with yesterday, now I removed some of the stuff in the body tag. This is an element selector because it is an HTML element that we are now going to style, provide a presentation layer or presentation instruction. So, that's what this is, a selector. Now, there are 4 different types of selectors. And then there are things that are built off of that. So the first thing is, if you ever see an asterisk in your CSS, this is called the universal selector. It means it matches every single HTML element. It also matches every single class, CSS class, and every single CSS ID. Everything. So where you may see this being used, and you may want to even consider this, at the top of a style sheet, you may see something like margin 0, padding 0, clear both. You know, the kind of idea that at the very top of a document, it's trying to make sure there's no hidden padding, there's no hidden margins, there's no hidden floats, you know, aligning things improperly. It's trying to say, we're going to apply this to everything. And then if we turn around and we add a padding of 25 pixels here, well, the body tag is going to override the universal selector because, as I said at the very beginning, because it's a cascading style sheet, the last time an element is given a rule set, a declaration inside the rule set, it's given him a declaration, it will override the first thing it does. But if I don't put any padding 25 pixels here, this body is going to take margin 0, padding 0, and I don't have to repeat myself. So Jan, yes, it is kind of a wildcard. It is a universal selector. It is used for everything. Basically, it's a very simple way of a reset because it applies to absolutely everything. Now, then we have the element selector. This matches a regular HTML tag, an element. So if we had a paragraph tag, lorem ipsum, let me just type that out, lorem ipsum, close the paragraph. If we had a block quote, lorem ipsum, these are elements. So if I wanted to target the block quote for a presentation layer or the paragraph tag, all I have to do is type block quote, whatever I'm going to put in here, and the paragraph tag, whatever you're going to put in there. That's an element selector. Any HTML tag, whether it's a form, a block quote, an unordered list, anything like this, you do not have to have a CSS class or a CSS ID assigned to it in order to target it. Well, what are these classes and IDs that we're talking about? Well, sometimes we may have things like a div that has an ID equals container, and then in that we'll have a div class equals content. And then maybe at the very end we close that div and we close that div. So we've got a container and a content. An ID selector matches the element here, container, and in the style sheet that will appear as a # container, and then we have the declaration block. A class is a content, or it is a period, and then the declaration block. Well, what's the point of having two different ones? There's actually several, and I'm only going to probably touch on two of them. The first one is an ID. You should only have a single instance of that ID on a page. Think about it as it's the larger wrapper for that page. Now, you do not have to have any IDs on a web page, but most people will have them as their wrappers where you'll only have a single version of that. But for the classes, we can have multiple types of classes. Where this is seen in practice is maybe we have a div here, and then we can put another div class content. There. Well, we already have the closing div here. But we're only going to put one ID of the container. Now, I could do this. Div ID equals container 2. But I would then have to go style this separately from this. When you have two IDs as wrappers, this treats it as a whole element that is now being contained inside this ID. Now, Barbara, not the entire website, the entire page. You should only, maybe you have the ID container on every single one of your pages, but you're not going to have 5 containers, 5 ID containers. The ID selector. But you can have infinite number of class selectors. Basically, it is just being an element that is being assigned a reusable style. So I like to think about it. Another way to think about it is there's going to be a single use of this style. There could be multiple reuses of this style. Now, there's another reason to know about IDs versus classes, and it actually has to do with a bit more of a HTML structure. In HTML, like an anchor tag, you can put an ID in the link. Like this. And if this ID, container 2, this will automatically link to that section. So if you have a really long page, a great way to use IDs, CSS IDs, is a way to say this is a separate element on this page or separate container structure on this page, and you can actually link to them. So I'm only just briefly touching on that because it really doesn't have to do with our presentation layer. Okay, so we have universal selector, element selector, ID selectors, and class selectors. That's what they look like in the style sheet. But in order to, there's really another one, an attribute selector. Yesterday, I briefly had said, well, if we are working in a, I'm just going to make a fake form here, and we have, let's say we have one input field, and we'll do two. Type equals text, label equals name. All right, and then we're going to have another input of type equals submit. Label equals submit. So in this, if we were to quick take a look at this, notice how both of these, and again, I'm going to go jump back and forth. Let me actually add a break so you can see them on two different lines. Both of these are input fields. So let's see. We have an input field here, and we have an input field here, which is being treated as a submit button. So while these are the four types of selectors, there's one more called an attribute selector. We briefly talked about this yesterday, that it is important that any attribute that is needed in a HTML element, you use it, because then we can target it and use an attribute selector. So if we wanted to target the submit button and make this submit button much bigger, well, how are you going to do that if for whatever reason there is no CSS class? So this is an important thing to remember for your WordPress sites, because there are some form plugins that may not add the exact style, the exact CSS class or the ID that you want. So we need to know how to target and use an attribute selector. So in our style sheet, we might do something like input. Again, that's using an element selector like this, where we're targeting an actual HTML element. And before we open the declaration block, we start filling out the information that is pulled from the attribute. So we just pretty much wrap the attribute, and that would be both the property and the value, so that now we can do font size equals 40 pixels. So while we're targeting the input field, we're only targeting the one with submit. So if I'm going to add this, if I were to add this up here into the style sheet of the page so we can actually see it in real life, I'm just adding it to this document so that we can see it. It's in the head, in a style, It should target only this submit button. And yes, it got a little bit bigger. Well, let's actually make it much bigger. 80. Oops. Let's change the color. Hold on. Got to go back here, go back here. I'll just grab this. Okay, so see, our color of the text went to red. So, these are our element selectors. Sorry, these are our selectors. Universal, element, ID, class, and then attribute selector. Any HTML element that has an attribute, whether it's an anchor tag, an image link, any of those type of parts of HTML, you can target in your CSS. But where we need to start doing and getting better at, especially if we're doing work for clients, is to know how to combine all of these so that we can truly target exactly what we're looking at. And this is where we start to combine selectors. Now, sure, I can sit there and say, if I want to, let's just say I want to add color to every single one of, let's say I want to add color to the container, to the content, to the block quote. Again, I'm just using these as examples. I can come through here and start saying, all right, I've got my container, comma. I've got my content, comma. And I have my block quote. And I can do color equals green, whatever. This says each one of the comma says each one of these are treated as if I wrote them individually. When we're dealing with our the declaration, of the selector, the rule set, the comma says each of these are treated as independent selectors and each of them get this color green. Well, where it gets starting to be complicated is when we start not using the comma. And that would be, let's just do this. I'm going to take this away. And now we're simply doing a content block quote. So this would say it matches all the elements that are descendant of a primary specified element. The last element that is specified is what is called the primary. So now when we have content, the class content block quote, it will mean, okay, here's content, here's block quote. So this is the only thing that is being targeted. Well, what if we had a block quote outside of content? Block quote. Muffins. Okay, so we have a block quote up here, and we have a block quote inside the class content. Because we set up this as a descendant selector, this is the primary, but the primary only gets affected if it is a descendant of content class, which means this will not get any of the styling, the presentation layer, the declaration blocks. Only this block quote will, because it is descendant of this. So anytime you see this, this is a descendant anywhere on the document. Anywhere on the HTML. The child selector is slightly different. And this would be, let's do, I'm going to keep using the word content because we'll change things. A child selector means it is only the immediate child or the immediate next level down that will get the blue color. So where this would look, let's go back in and we're going to add some stuff to this HTML. So here we are in our content. So here's the div class content. Sure, we got a block quote, but we got a paragraph here. This is a paragraph. Then we have a div class green, and inside the div class green is another paragraph. Close the div. Okay, so if we were using a descendant, which would mean like this, if we did this, I'm changing this up. If we'd had content paragraph, that would mean this paragraph, because it's descendant of the content, gets the green style. So does this one, because this paragraph still is descendant underneath the content, like this. But when we do a child selector for blue, so content, and it's the greater than sign, or however you want to, the brace or the pointer, it says only if the paragraph tag is a child selector, which would mean this paragraph gets the blue. This one will not, because it is not a direct, it's not a child selector. It is a sub child. Does that make sense so far? Because we're about ready to get a little bit more nuanced here. All right, one more. Content plus paragraph is called the adjacent sibling selector. Color red. Now this will only occur if underneath the class content is the adjacent sibling selector of paragraph tag. Well, guess what? Even though there are two paragraph tags inside the content, none of these are going to be getting the red, because it's not immediately adjacent. These are sub. What would happen, this is adjacent. Do you see why it's adjacent? It's at the same, quote, tab level. So we have a class, and immediately adjacent to that element is a paragraph tag. There's the big reason why this is important here. So this would get the color red. This is, I like to consider this one because this is the descendant, this is the container. This is only the immediate inside, and this is next to. Why is this important with WordPress? WordPress has dynamic things. Sometimes we build the sites for the clients where they may turn something on or turn something off based on whether they've got an advertisement running. Maybe you have built something that allows them to do an alert, a notification at the very top. So what happens if we have something like that? So inside our body tag, maybe your website looks like this, and you've got a div ID header, and that's going to be special header information that is visible. So we'll call this our visible banner. And then maybe you have a, let's do inside your header, you've got a class of product. You're just calling it overviews. And you've got all sorts of product. Maybe you got product slideshows here. Product slides. But every once in a while, maybe you have a conditional thing that says you have a div class special news. And that special news is only displayed if they turn something on or off in the admin area, in their setting area. But if they, let's say what if they don't have that? For some reason, it's turned off. Are we going to be treating the style of, maybe you have space in between here, maybe you don't. Maybe you need additional padding if the visible banner and the product slides are side by side. Maybe you need a top bar that will separate this. So one of the ways we can do this is, let's say if the header is the adjacent sibling, if the product overviews is an adjacent sibling to header, meaning they're directly next to each other, we can do something like header plus product overviews, border top 5 pixels solid red. And it will only occur if those are side by side, if they're adjacent. But if for some reason your client has turned on and activated the special news item, well, guess what? These are no longer adjacent. So therefore, even though this is in your style, you're fine. But what if we then need to add something like a special news and product overviews, padding top 10 pixels. So when we talk about the dynamic nature of WordPress, because maybe they have a featured image on a blog post, but how are you going to display the content if there is no featured image? That's where, with WordPress developers, understanding how we combine selectors, we're thinking ahead so that we can add the padding, add certain things for images or featured images based on the relationship of combining selectors. Does that make sense? It's a way for us not to have to hard code each document, each page specific, but we can think ahead. Well, what if the client adds this? What if they don't add this? What if I add it as their developer? Can I think ahead for what we would need for this and simply write the code already based on what is already done? All right. So those are our elements, our selectors, and how we combine the selectors. Now we have something called pseudo classes. This is where it gets to be a point where we can begin to target the presentation style based on interaction with the client, interaction with somebody who is visiting the website. And I'm just going to use the basic paragraph tag here in this. Actually, let's do it here so you can see it. So I'm going to Let me just save this, make sure, okay, we've got this stuff. So I'm up here in our style on the page. I'm going to use a paragraph tag, and I'm going to assign it the color red, which means all our paragraphs should turn, the ones that are paragraphs should turn into red. Now you might be wondering, why isn't this? Because this is actually a block quote. So we got a paragraph. See, this is a paragraph, this is a block quote. That's why this is not red. All right, but we do have a few others. Pseudo classes allow us to begin adding interactivity. We may have heard, some of you may have heard of things like hover. Hover is a pseudo class, and pseudo classes have a single colon that separates the selector and the pseudo class. This allows us to, only when this element, this selector, has a hover state. Notice how now we're able to turn each of these red based on simply hovering over. Many people are used to these pseudo classes being used in terms of anchor tags, links. And this is where we would see, and I'm just going to put them here because we would have things like link. This would match an anchor tag element that has been unvisited, meaning it is a link, it has not been visited yet, so we can change the display presentation. We can use visited to say, has this browser that is visiting me already clicked on this link? We can have an active. So this is the process. It is about ready to be activated. This has almost zero state in the mobile world or in a touchscreen world. This state is much more of at the point where a mouse button is clicked down, and before you release that button. That is the active state. Is if you click on it, and actually I can still show you this one. What I'm actually holding the mouse down, I just lifted the mouse up. I'm holding the mouse down, I'm lifting the mouse up. There is a very cool trick that you can do with this type of active pseudo class, and not many people take advantage of it because it's not really something that is going to work in the mobile world. But if you need a desktop related item, and you can simply press, you can say press this button or press this image to get more information. And so you can switch back and forth between a text thing and then the image. It's a press and hold. Active state is a hold here. And then we have our hover, and we have a focus. Focus is a unique one that many people get confused about. But a focus is when we use the keyboard to tab through parts of a website. And again, if you didn't know this, any page you're on, you can, and it's not going to actually work on this because it's not, Coda is not a full browser. But if you had elements that you could tab through, so actually I can show you on this one. If our input, if we do a focus, let's do this. Let me fix this. We'll do this. I'll show you input field, focus. We're going to change the font size to 50 pixels. Okay. So notice how I just tabbed here. This is big text. But when we tab off to something else, this is no longer the focus. So when you're developing sites for clients, especially if you have a contact form in a WordPress site, simply having something like this using a pseudo class of focus, attaching it to the input field with zero JavaScript or anything else, you can make the size that they are working through, tabbing through, it's going to stand out. Focus works on mobile devices because when we click on an input field, that becomes the focus. So it's just something to think about. We've got links, visited, active. We've got hover and focus. And then we have a whole bunch of pseudo classes that talk about, we're going to go back to the paragraph tag. Paragraph tag. We have something like first child. Now, most of these items, we're going to go through here and do something like an li. Actually, let me just talk about, I'm going to just talk about these not attached to anything. First child matches the element only if it's the first child element of a parent element. What that means is in this one, let's talk about, let's add this. We're going to add a few paragraphs here. Okay, so if I were to say paragraph first child, we'll go back to the color reds because it stands out a little bit more. And we go preview this. Notice how each of these are paragraphs, and this is the first child. Now you might be wondering, why is, where's the other paragraph? Let's see how this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph. Now, explain the, oops, hold on. No, this, I need to be on the right document. Okay. So this container, the class content, has 3 child elements. They're all paragraphs. So when we do the paragraph, if it is a first child, the first element inside, and it is a paragraph tag, the color is red. Great. So that's understandable why this, because these 3 are paragraph tags, this is the first one. But why, when this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph, and this is a paragraph, why is it only this one? So let's take a look at that. So, when we say this is a paragraph, okay, it is inside a class content. It's the first paragraph, but guess what? It's not the first child. The first child of this div, class content, is a block quote. So therefore, since it doesn't say block quote, this would not work. Well, neither will this one, because it is not a child that is first of ID container 2. It is a child of container 2, but it's not the first child that is a paragraph type, because that's a block quote. But now this one is red. It is the first child of this div, and so therefore this is red. Does that make sense why this one is red, the others are not? Okay. If at any time you have any questions, feel free to ask. So we've got a first child. We've got an nth child. And it may sound weird, nth child, and then you put a number here. But if I did an nth child 2 and went here, guess what? That's the second child. So that gets the color. Oh, well, look, this one now gets the color, the paragraph. Well, it's because it is the second element. It's the second child of div content that is a paragraph tag. This is a paragraph tag that is a child, but it's not the second. This is not the second element of this. So when we start working with the nth child, basically we're just saying, which number are you? This is also a very helpful thing to master in WordPress, because we can start saying, let's say you have a WordPress website theme that uses divs, just straight divs, and maybe there are 6 divs, whether or not you have a header, a footer, something else, whatever. Maybe you need to simply have if the div, and the second div, whether it is a navigation, whether it is the header, whatever is the second div, and maybe you won't do a div, you'd have a specific class. It's just a very easy way to start styling things. It is also a very easy way that if you're trying to display content in a blog post, a long blog post, this is where you can have things like, well, the 4th paragraph, we'll make that stand out slightly by increasing the font size. So the 4th one will increase the font size, or that's how you get these long form articles that no matter how it's written, it's always going to be the 3rd paragraph that is slightly to the left, or that has the space for the image that the featured image gets placed. So therefore, maybe we need to adjust the 3rd paragraph styling. That's how we're doing it with this nth child. Many times you may want to say the conclusion of your blog post. We can do a last child. So it's going to simply take the paragraph. Now, how can you prevent this from happening for all of the paragraphs? Well, that's where we would wrap it inside a content. And that's when we begin saying descendant selectors combined with a pseudo class, so that the last paragraph of anything inside the content is going to turn around and have the red. This is the last one that's inside, so that gets it. These are not the last ones. So we can really play around with combining selectors and then starting to use pseudo classes. There are other things, whether you're talking about first letter, matches the first letter of a specific one. That's a great way to do drop caps. You could do first of type. So this is only saying the first time a paragraph appears on the website, on the web page, will we apply this certain type of color. Maybe it's the last of a type. Most of the time you might see something like instead of paragraphs, you might have a list item. So the last in the list. This is the perfect example. Li first of type. So we could do a border top 1 pixel dashed gray. And then last of type would be a border bottom 1 pixel dashed CCC. So then when we're sitting in here and we have an unordered list item, and I'm just going to duplicate this a number of times. Format it. And then maybe later on, actually I'm going to add an ordered list down here just so that we can have some space here. Then we have an ordered list. There's our list item. When we take a look at this, because we said list item first of type, last of type, notice how we were able to put kind of a border at the top and a border at the bottom of our list items. And it doesn't matter if the client says, you know what, I need to add a whole bunch more list items. It will still just go on the first and the last. And a great way to begin to customize how things will appear, regardless of how much content gets written or generated dynamically. All right. I told you we would have a little bit of conversation because when we're dealing with all these pseudo classes, they're really hard to test unless you know a few tricks. So here's just a site that we were using, I think last week or the week before on. So there's all sorts of stuff going on. If you are not comfortable with the Chrome or the Firefox or the Safari inspector, and the easiest way to get that is just click on this item and click on a web page in Chrome, choose inspect. I believe in Safari you go to developer tools, inspector. Firefox also has an inspector that if you right click you can view the inspector items. Yes, you can see the HTML documents. Yes, you can see each of the styles that are being assigned. So basically it rips apart the style sheets that are being provided and only delivers the exact information that you want. But there's some hidden tricks to working with the inspector so that you can test out pseudo classes. So for example, let's just go over here and I'm going to right click just so I can see what's happening with the anchor tags. So another way to do it is whether you want to right click directly on the item that's going to pop up an anchor tag, or I can hit the selector, hover over so I can actually find that specific area. Oops. Actually, I didn't mean to actually link to that. So let's do it this way. Okay, so that over here is going to bring up, and I'm going to make this go a little bit higher so we can look at this. It's going to show us the anchor tags. Now, it does show us visited. Why? Because I just visited this by accident. I'm actually on this page. If we went back there, we won't see that. So let's inspect this. Yes, we're going to still see the visited because if you had not clicked on that link, you would not see this visited because it doesn't exist yet in the browser's memory. But I can look at this and say, okay, here's the anchor tag. And it looks like text decoration is underline color. Well, when I hover over this, how can I test? Because look, the underline goes away when you hover. Well, where is that? Because all I see is this underline. Some may try and come in here and start typing. You visit the element, and then sure, we can add hover, and then maybe we can test some stuff, but that's not the best way to do it. The best way to deal with these pseudo classes is to make sure you're on the element that you want. On the element that you want. So everything we're going to play around with now is up here in this element.style. Click on this hover. This is going to toggle all different pseudo classes that we can use. So now when I click on hover, it is going to show me, and it's pretending that someone is actually hovering on this anchor tag. And it's going to open up where in the style sheet that anchor hover for the site title, content entry header, a hover is appearing. And we're also seeing that anchor hover, it has the text decoration of none on line 210 of the style sheet. Well, what if I want to change what happens with this hover? If you are using the latest version of Chrome, you get some new cool tools that have never existed for a long time. One of them is, notice how I came over here to the very edge. I didn't quite touch the 3 circles. I came to the bottom, scrolled over, and now if I don't know how to write CSS, if I don't understand the declaration blocks that I'm putting in there, I can say, do you want to add a text shadow? Sure. Add a text shadow. How do I want to do it? Do I want to spread it out here? What type of a blur do I want? I need to offset it by 5 pixels here and 4 pixels here. So notice how I'm starting to set this. Again, we may not have much, because right now it's being overwritten. So I would have to actually go in here. And for some reason, if you're doing this, you're playing around and all of a sudden it's saying, oh, no, you have an invalid property value. Most likely, it's being overwritten somewhere else. Now, I can go through here. Let me get rid of this. Hold on. I'm going to hover over this area where we can also set box shadows, add colors, and we have all sorts of coloring. Now, this is one of these cool things. I mean, it gets so deep in here that we now have the ability to actually see contrast. If you're wondering, we get a good rating for the current color that is working for the hover. But if I start bringing this down here so that my hover is changing, becoming more like a white on white, notice how I got a bad contrast ratio. Meaning people are not going to be able to see it. It's going to basically disappear. So when I start checking this, I can actually see a contrast ratio for anybody who wants to visibly come in here and view this. Normally, you're always trying to have something that is a contrast of higher than 7. But it's buried in here of trying to set your colors, your background colors. Once you set your background color, there is no type of contrast because the contrast is always being attached to the font color. Contrast will also be able to handle size of font. If you make it too small, that's going to eliminate some of the contrast and readability. So buried within this hover element is the ability to change things and show what it would be like if the focus was on. Well, notice how the focus actually shows that what is happening on the focus. So we have a number of things that are going on here. And so let's go back here. Let me refresh just so we clear anything else. So when we're at the anchor tag, and let's come over here to the regular post. That's what we're going to, it's the title. So this would be like a blog post title, entry title here. So if that's what we're trying to target, and because it's an anchor link, that's what we would want to style. We can add in whatever style we want, font size, 50 pixels, makes it a lot bigger. The nice thing about playing around in this inspector area is we get autocomplete. If you're a newer user of CSS, you have full autocomplete. If you want to talk about border bottom color. So we actually have autocomplete for everything that you can think of with CSS. And at this point, since we're targeting the anchor tag, what if we want to create our own style rule? So we click on this and it's going to say anchor. Why? Because that is what we are hovering. It selects that element, anchor. And notice how it starts in the selector area. The text editing ability starts in the selector area, not in the declaration block where if we were using here, it's just using the declaration block. This is so that we can add in our own plus I don't have anything that is from there, but if you have an anchor that's right next to a paragraph tag, then we can add in our color green. You know, all that's trying to say is if you have an anchor tag next to a paragraph tag, let's actually do this. We're going to add this. So we've got this. It's now part of the inspector style sheet. So as long as we don't refresh the page, we will still have all this. But by hitting the plus button, when we are hovered over this, it starts to do a selector, and we can edit the selector and use those relationships we talked about earlier. So if I were to come in here, again, I haven't moved off of this. I could right click, or I can come over here to the three bars and I can click edit as HTML. This is how part of the time when you're working with WordPress and you're not sure where you need to edit something or change something, or you want to customize something, or you want to tweak something, or you're there at the client site and they say, hey, can you move something over? Can you add a little bit of text? Rather than saying to the client, you know, well, this is a dynamically generated site and I would have to go create a custom post type for you in order to display this. Bam. You can come over here and say, well, I know this is where they want the information. I'm going to edit this as HTML, which means it simply opens this element and I can start doing this is all amazing stuff. Close the paragraph. When we leave this by clicking off of this now editing box, or by clicking on something else, we're going to have this is all amazing stuff now showing up. Notice how this is green. Now, maybe it would be helpful if we did a different color. Yellow. Oops. Just so that you can see. Well, you can't even see that at all, but you can see. So notice how when we first did our new style rule for anchor, we were able to do an adjacent sibling by using a plus paragraph. And because the a plus paragraph is at the same level, that I can actually see the style I'm applying. So when you start to wrap your brain around what you can do with CSS and how you can target items, and you begin to work on styling, we always have to remember there's a lot we can do to add the pseudo classes as well as the relationships between elements for us to do something really unique. There. I'll put your mind at ease. Everybody's brain can stop leaking due to yellow text. So once you've got all of these items, guess what we can now do? When we are looking at, again, you may have said, well, you've added a whole bunch of, if we added things, how can we look at that information? So what we're looking for is the inspector style sheet. The inspector style sheet will come up and say, these are all the things that you have added. So if we add a whole bunch of things, let's add something else over here. So again, I haven't left this page. Let's go ahead, go to the inspector. I'm on let's do the entry title. Let's add a border 5 pixels solid. Great. And then we'll do a border radius 5 pixels or 25 pixels. And then we'll add a padding 15 pixels. Okay, so we've got something going on here. We're doing styling. That's so awesome. This is where we can begin to, if you want to see all the stuff that you've done, and I'm holding on this plus button. These are all the style sheets that may be used on this page. I come down to Inspector Style Sheet. Oops. Well, that's another way to get to it. I'm going to click on this, and why didn't it? Hold on. Close that. Oh, hold on. Go back to the elements. All right, here we are. So this is all the tests. So we would have to then add this because this element style is not going to be used directly. So when I'm looking at this, I am going to, because again, I went ahead in here, when I'm hovered over here, and I've tested this using the element style because I'm not quite sure, I could then copy and paste this and put it down here, and it now will show up in my inspector. All the stuff that we've done. So basically, the big thing to remember is anything you put in the element style is, think about it as RAM. It's only read and only memory. It's only going to affect the page when you want to start assigning it to something. Add it here. Now, Stacy, great question. The frustrating part, figure out where to add it to make the style sheets to make it live. The best thing to do is always put it at the end of your child theme, your WordPress child theme style sheet. Because if it doesn't show up, it means there's something else that's loading after it. Basically, your child theme is going to be the last thing that loads unless a plugin is loading their style incorrectly. Meaning it's trying to be the last thing. So, this is just a quick, we probably do need to do a ton of stuff with this inspector. But hopefully at least this can start you going beyond what most of us have used the inspector for. And so just a quick recap. Use your pseudo classes. When you are clicking on an element that you're like, I know this is the element that I want. Why? Because I tested it out here. I'm selected here. This is affecting it. So therefore, I am going to create, I'm going to create a plus, a new style rule, which will identify that exact element. And then you can just copy whatever you put in the element here. It adds it to the inspector style sheet. The inspector style sheet will clear when you refresh. It's gone. So, side pro tip, don't try and use the inspector to style anything on an auto-refreshing WordPress page because you'll lose all of your work. So understanding the relationships, how our rule sets and our selectors are combined is vital for anyone really wanting to harness the power of WordPress to style it because it's a dynamic content management system. So if you have any questions, we've definitely gone into the ish time. You can definitely ask them in the Slack channel for members. If you're not a member yet, definitely email me and I'll see if I can help you out. This replay will be up in both the members channel and the YouTube channel later today. And don't forget, tomorrow we're going to dive into PHP for those of you who are wanting to understand how WordPress uses most of PHP. So take care, have a great rest of the day, and I will see you on the other side.